Joining us now, Rob Wittman, Republican, 1st District of Virginia. And he got reelected a week ago. Of course, we've had him on since then. Hey, in the meantime, though, I went to bed on election night feeling pretty good about it. We were down, 26 seats and looked like we picked up 4 seats in the U.S. Senate. Since then, it's been an avalanche of Democrat victories from mail-in ballots, all over the place. They went from gaining 25 or 26 seats to now it looks like 35. They picked up another 10. It appears that way. Picked up 2 of the Senate seats that we thought we'd have. In fact, the mail-in ballots in Montana ran tester 90-10 when they came in. And same with Arizona for the Democrat there. So not quite the blue wave, but the Democrats seem to be winning all of these races that were too close to call when we went to bed. They won them all. They ran the table. Pretty amazing, right? Oh, these ballots show up at the final minute. Just seems like Ronald Romney was telling me the other day on the radio before the election of how they got all these early balloting and they set records. And I don't see the results of that, Ronna. It's just, you creamed in every single one of them. Joining us now to talk about policy and all that good stuff and how he's going to work with the new Speaker of the House, appears to be Nancy Pelosi, is Congressman Rob Wittman. Congressman, 1st District, Virginia, Republican. Great to have you.
John, good morning. Great to be with you.
So right off the bat, the president outlines a prison reform bill that we could actually see bipartisan support for in Congress right off the bat. Is that something, as it's been presented to you right now, as it makes its way through the legislative process, something Rob Wittman could get behind?
Yes, John. I think criminal justice reform is long overdue. We talk about re-entry of folks that have served their time and have been convicted of nonviolent crimes. We want to make sure that they're able to re-enter. Criminal justice reform allows them to do that. Makes sentencing a little more logical with folks. And I've met with a number of different groups throughout the district, and both families of those individuals that have served their time, community groups, and there's a broad expanse of agreement on this about making sure that we are fair and thoughtful with those folks that have committed crimes, but also have served their time and are wanting to get back into society. And I think the United States is a place where we are going to hold people accountable, but also provide forgiveness to them to make sure that they can get back to a lifestyle that they can sustain themselves and not all back into what put them in prison to begin with. And I think that's a critical element. I've talked to a number of folks that have said, hey, listen, I just want to get back into the workplace, and it becomes extraordinarily difficult for them to reenter. Criminal justice reform allows some of that to happen so that those folks can become productive members of society again, and they have paid the price for their mistakes. And again, I want to emphasize this is, for nonviolent crimes, but also looking at sentencing too, looking at, what's a fair and thoughtful way to sentence, giving judges, some reasonable amount of discretion and looking at the case specifically and not structuring it so much that in every case, you have these long sentences that sometimes aren't commensurate with the nature of the crime that's committed. So yes, I think there's a broad expanse of support here. I've had a lot of conversations with Congressman Bob Goodlatte, who's chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Also, Representative Morgan Griffith, who, as you know, played a big role when he was in the House of Delegates on criminal justice reform. So I think there's broad-based support for this.
Let me ask you something on this topic, Representative Dr. Wittman. What do you think about, and I've been an advocate of this, as you know, for some time, so just to put my cards on the table, would you be in favor of states and jurisdictions getting rid of the cash bail system, which really, Congressman, if you look at it logically, is very discriminatory towards lower class and lower income people that don't have cash to put up for bail, don't have the credit for a bail bondsman to put it up, can't give them a credit card or whatever. So they sit in jail, lose their car, lose their job because they can't put cash bail up. Where if you have the resources to put it up, you get out and get a lawyer and go on with stuff. Would you be in favor of just getting rid of that policy totally? Cash bail.
Well, John, I think you bring up a great point. There is a big disparity there. I would want to look at what would we do if we were to get rid of cash bail. What would we do to substitute it to make sure we had assurance that people wouldn't flee, that people would show up for their court dates, to make sure that justice is served. I have no problem with replacing it. The key is what would you do? What would you put in place to replace it to make sure that there was an assurance that person was going to show up in court? I think there's probably ways to do that, but you are right. There is a disparity in who has the cash to be able to be released from jail, and in not many instances are people released on self-recognizance if it's a significant crime. So I think that there are ways to replace it, and yes, I would be amenable to finding a way to replace that.
What about allowing felons the right to vote, or I should say, phraseology, former felons, so you did your time and you get out of jail and now you're trying to get your life back together. Last thing we want is recidivism for them to go back in. But a lot of felons can't vote because they still owe a fine, back child support or whatever. Then they were in jail. They don't have a job. That debt grows. So they haven't paid the financial restitution, but they paid their time in prison, in jail, whatever. But then they come out, they can't vote. Are you in favor of restoring those voting rights, or do you want to wait until everything is paid off?
Well, John, I do think there's a responsibility for the person that's committed the crime to make full restitution, not just in the penalty that they pay to society, but also if judgment is rendered that they have to pay restitution for their crime to the individual they committed the crime against. I do think that's one of the obligations for them to be back in good standing with society. And one of the elements of good standing is receiving back your right to vote. So I do think that there needs to be that level of requirement there. I think that rather than, as we saw in Virginia with a mass restoration of voting rights, I think that each case needs to be looked at individually. But I do believe that individual, those individuals that are required to make restitution should have to do that in order to receive that right back, because I want to make sure that they have not only paid their debt to society, but they have made whole those people who have been affected by the crime. So we have to not only focus on the person committing the crime, but we have to focus, too, on the victim of the crime. And many times that gets forgotten, although today I will say this, that courts and prosecutors and others are much more thoughtful today of victims of crime than they have been in the past. And as you know, we have in many systems victims' rights advocates that are there to make sure that the victim is properly considered in the court proceedings, and that includes what happens afterwards. So I would want to make sure that we are looking with equal vigor, not only what we do to try to get the person that committed the crime, back into society so they can work, so they can have a life that keeps them from going back to jail, but also making sure that we are respectful and mindful of the impact on the victims.
You're listening to the John Fredericks Radio Network. We're with Congressman Dr. Rob Wittman. He represents the 1st District of Virginia. That's the central Virginia area through Fredericksburg and surrounding areas. He is a Republican, and he is also the current chairman of the Sea Power Committee on Sea Power Readiness, and soon to be going from chairman to ranking member as the Democrats have taken over the committee chairs in the House of Representatives when they all get seated in January. Congressman, a couple questions here. Let's get to leadership. Your new minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, winning easily. I really thought the Jordan challenge would be a little bit tougher. McCarthy winning easily. Why?
Well, I think there are a number of things there. Listen, Jim Jordan's my next-door neighbor. I like Jim. Jim has really worked hard to make sure that issues that are important for committee functions there, both in places like government oversight and reform and judiciary, brought to the forefront. Kevin, though, traveled across the country, helped a lot of different Republican candidates, helped them in their races, is close with the president, has worked with the president. The president, I think, thinks a lot of Kevin. I think he does also of Jim Jordan. So, what I see coming out of this is that, Kevin in his role as minority leader, but also I think there's a role for Jim Jordan. I'm very supportive of Jim becoming the ranking member on either one of the committees that he serves on. He's on judiciary and on government oversight and reform, and I think he'd be very good in those roles. So I think that there's a place for both of them. I think the conference looked at it and said, what have they both done in total? They have both, I think, worked hard on issues that are important to our total conference. But I think overall, people looked at, not only what have they done, but, what's the vision going forward? What are we going to do, first of all, in the minority, which is very, very good,
right,
having served in the minority when I first got to Congress. But then, what's the vision and the plan to regain the majority? And I think that has to be the focus, because I remember coming to Congress in 2007 when we were in the minority, and there was a pretty keen focus on what to do to regain the majority. And leadership kept us on track, and we were able to regain that. So I think Kevin put out there, a very clear and viable vision on how we not only do our jobs now, but what do we do to get ourselves back in the majority.
Dr. Wittman, staying along the lines of party leadership, there appears now there might be a challenge in the Democratic caucus to making Nancy Pelosi Speaker. 17 Democrats have signed a letter saying they're not voting for her. There's a lot of others coming in that are not going to vote for her either. So that now seems at risk. Yet 3 New York Republican congressmen came out yesterday and said, look, if she's 3 votes below the threshold she needs, we'll vote for her, putting her over the top. Could you ever envision yourself voting for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker?
No. No, I just could not. I mean, the process of selecting a speaker is, I think, about, who do you envision being best in running the Congress, and I just could not do that. I think it's. And listen, I understand strategically about doing that, saying, well, if we put her in, then there's the ability for to draw contrast between her and what we are doing. But I think the purpose of the body is not just the political side, but also how the body operates and what we as Republicans view is the direction of the government. And I just can't see in any way, shape, or form that being accomplished in any way with Nancy Pelosi.
Congressman Wittman, you said a couple of minutes ago in our conversation that you've been talking with former or still Judiciary Chairman, the retiring Bob Goodlatte from 6th District of Virginia, replaced by Ben Klein, retired. Do you envision a circumstance where Bob Goodlatte could be the United States Attorney General?
Well, certainly, the president has that within his purview to do that. I was just talking to Bob yesterday about what the future may hold, and certainly that's for him to determine. But it didn't come up in conversation that was on the slate of things. Although I feel pretty certain that if the president were to contact Chairman Goodlatte, I think he would give it pretty serious consideration. And I think if he was chosen, he would make an extraordinarily capable and really effective Attorney General.
He'd be great. Let's get to the Khashoggi affair. So the Saudis changed their story again. Basically, This is facts by installment. Whenever Erdogan, you have to admit, I mean, as a communications professional yourself, and you've got a PhD in public policy, you've studied this stuff, you do have to admit that President Erdogan in Turkey has masterfully manipulated the media narrative with Khashoggi. This ought to be taught in Harvard Communication Business School, the way Erdogan has done this, dripped and dribbled the information out, then gave it to Gina Haspel when she went to Turkey. She told the president. He didn't make it public. He's kept this thing in the news. The Saudis have now changed their story for the 8th time. I mean, it's a comedy of errors. Keystone Cops. You can't believe anything that's coming out of Riyadh now. Is that going to affect policy change? And I want to start specifically with the U.S. involvement in the Yemeni civil war, backing the Saudi Emirates coalition there. Do you see a change in policy as a result of the Khashoggi debacle?
John, I think that the U.S. policy with Saudi Arabia, with the conflict with Yemen and the Houthis in Yemen, I do think will come to the forefront as far as how the United States, specifically the U.S. Congress, views that particular conflict, views what the Saudis should or should not be doing there. I'm anxious. I'm actually leaving this afternoon to go to Turkey, so I will be visiting with the officials there in Turkey concerning the Khashoggi matter as well as national security matters and how Turkey is working with the United States on a number of issues in that region, both with Syria, with Iran, with the Saudis. So I'm going to get an on-the-ground perspective from leadership there in Turkey about that. But yes, I do think that will have an impact. That's one of the reasons I'm going there, is I want to hear directly from the Turkish government, from the government of Turkey, of what they see in this whole matter. And remember, too, that for years, they have been sort of outside of what has been the dynamic between Shias and Sunnis in the region. This brings them much closer into that back and forth between that tension and conflict between those two entities in the region. I want to hear from Turkey what their perspective is. So in the long run, yes, I think it'll focus much more attention on the policies the United States has with Saudi Arabia, the dynamic there between Sunni interests with those aligned with Saudi Arabia, the Shia interests, those aligned with Iran, and the entities within that region that are, pursuing that conflict back and forth, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen, whether it's what's happening with vestiges of ISIS still left in Syria, what's happening also in Iraq. You don't hear a lot of mention of that, but there's still things happening in Iraq and Kurdistan and those areas. So I'm anxious to get there and hear Turkey's perspective on what's happening there in the region. But I do think it'll focus a lot more attention and questions from the Congress as to U.S. policy and relations with Saudi Arabia. And I believe, at least from my personal perspective, that I am looking very keenly at what actions will the Saudis pursue in light of this brutal murder of Khashoggi, and who within their government is going to be held responsible. I think that's the key, John. And if certain things don't happen there, I do believe that the Congress is going to take very certain and specific action.
And the next time you go to Riyadh, and if MBS Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, stays in power, and we only have a minute, if he stays in power, and you sit down and meet with him, I mean, how do you take anything he says seriously? I mean, isn't that a real issue, just credibility of an international leader?
Well, it is, in the entire structure there in the Saudi government, with the back and forth, as you said, with things changing, with the story, and obviously with the integrity of that whole storyline. Yes, it does, I think, affect the relationship and how the United States deals with them. I mean, it would affect any individual relationship. If you have somebody that is not truthful with you and does repeatedly, it affects that relationship. And I do think that it will with the Saudis. The Saudis are going to have to prove, I think, to the United States their level of integrity and what they've done to hold people accountable. I
got to go. Thank you, Dr. Rob Wittman, Congressman, 1st District, Republican, Virginia. More information, wittman.house.gov.